recording this to the cloud in week 8 of R795 dissertation proposal preparation. And it is the spring of 2024. We were going to have a few weeks ago a discussion on IRBs and human subjects and so forth with Adam Mills. And that got delayed a little bit to tonight. And I will say that those of you watching this and noticing that my ears are showing, my head didn't grow. I got a haircut. So I wanted to have shorter hair like Adam so all the guys could fit in nicely groomed and so forth. So so Adam Mills has come many times. In fact, there's a recording in your syllabus in the playlist. You could play it and watch it, but it's always best to have discussion and have Mika's coming back in. She must have lost her connection. It's always best to have your questions answered by the expert. And so that way you can ramp up in terms of your dissertation. Now, Adam, yesterday I met with every one of my 9 students in dissertation prep and talked to them about their dissertations and how it's going. And a lot of them had questions for you. So I'm surprised a couple aren't here yet, but they may just join us in process. So they're wrestling with these issues about, well, most of them are going to take quals, and then they have to do their proposals. So and I told them they have to start working on the IRBs. So you're going to be contacted by a couple of them pretty soon, if not already.
Okay.
So Adam, if you could give us not as you did last time, almost the kind of the shortened talk, so we have time for questions.
Sure. Yeah. I have a shorter slide or presentation that I'll kind of go through, and then we can definitely answer questions during it, and then of course always after that specific questions. So.
And you're in Bryan Hall, right? If they need to contact you.
So our office is actually on I forget the name of the building, but it's on the 509 building on 3rd Street. So we have several offices. So Bryan Hall, I think that's where like the vice president of research, where he's housed. But as far as the human subjects office, most of us are remote, but the 509 building on 3rd Street is essentially where we have office space. So
great. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and share my screen. Oh, I don't know if that is, there it is, yeah. Do you have the actual slides, or is it in the presentation view?
We're in presentation view.
Let me see.
And that can be good enough, but once in a while that happens.
Yeah, so. All right, this should be the right one. I think I had the wrong screen.
There you go.
Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, so I'll just dive right in. I guess I'll say a little bit about myself first. My name's Adam Mills. I'm from the Human Subjects Office. I've been with the Human Subjects Office since 2011. I've been reviewing for lots of different social and behavioral research throughout the years, and I get to meet lots of researchers, and hopefully I can provide some guidance and help for you to get your proposals out there or answer any questions. So I would like to start a little bit briefly about the history. So kind of why are there regulations? Until 1974, there weren't any human subjects research regulations or any sort of ethical review to make sure that the subjects were safe in research, and even more importantly too, not only physical safety, but privacy and confidentiality of the data. So making sure that when you collect data that it remains confidential, and that it's not going to be accessed by various people and things like that. So lots of research in the past, participants might have not even known that they were in research studies. They didn't really have anyone to kind of go to for any advocacy or anything like that. So if there was any risk or danger, there was no kind of reviewing committee or a human research protection program that they can contact to let them know about discomfort or harm or anything like that. And so that's essentially why, so with several studies in the past that were unethical, really gave the need for research regulations. So yeah, it wasn't until 1974 that there were any research regulations. And IU, we have we receive federal grant money. So any type of human subject research that's done, it has to be reviewed and approved by the Human Subjects Office and the IRB committee, or I should say, and or the IRB committee. So in our Human Research Protection Program, we have the Human Subjects Office. This is where I work. What we do is we provide administrative support to the IRBs. So we kind of prepare studies for them to give final review and approval. We provide guidance to the research community. So we're your resource to kind of help answer any questions you might have about the regulations or really any part of the process of your research. We will help provide guidance for you. The Human Subjects Office, we approve exempt research. I'll talk a little bit more about different levels of review, but there's a specific level called exempt research, and we'll actually review and approve that. So that research doesn't have to be reviewed by an IRB member. The IRB or the IRB committees, they're going to make the final determination on research. So this is research that's expedited or full board, kind of your risky research. They're going to review any sort of non-compliance in research. So if something was being done without approval or in a manner that wasn't approved, that should be reported to the IRB for them to kind of review and assess the risks and things like that. So we're kind of two different functions, but we're all part of the Human Research Protection Program. So what does an IRB do? The IRB, they're going to approve or disapprove non-exempt research before it's initiated. So that's a very big important step. If you're ever doing human subject research, you want to make sure that you get approval before you begin any research activities. And this is going to include recruiting and consenting subjects. So not only data collection, this would be the process before where you get participants, kind of where you identify and recruit participants to join your study. The IRBs, they're going to approve any changes made to a research proposal. So if you have an amendment to update your study, the IRB would want to review those changes that you're making. So this could be something small, where maybe you receive funding and you want to start paying participants for being in the study. You can update your study to add funding and update payment information or things like that. Or if you had to add a survey or even remove a survey for data collection, you could submit an amendment to update your procedures. So really any change that you after the study is approved, if you have to make any changes, the IRB would need to review and approve that. The IRBs, they conduct what's called continuing review of full board research studies. So some studies every year will have to be presented to the IRB to make sure that these are your risky studies where there's more than minimal risk, where the IRB is going to make sure that there's no unanticipated problems or risks that are happening to the participants that weren't expected. So, there might be some potential risks that you would expect to happen in research, and that we want to make sure that there's no additional risks that kind of manifested or that kind of weren't thought of at the onset of data collection or approval. The IRB, they can also suspend or terminate the approval of research. This is very rare. Usually when you go through the review process, we make sure that research is safe and ethical and that there's no essentially major risks. All risks are reduced in research, so that way it's safe for subjects, but they do have the role and authority to suspend or terminate the approval of research.
So Adam, I have a question before you go to the next slide.
Sure.
This has come up last semester and before. The second item on the list there, approve any changes in research before they can be implemented. Maybe you can talk about that some more as you go. For instance, you could talk about what kinds of changes wouldn't necessarily mandate a revision versus those that definitely would. For instance, students might have additional subjects which would require, students might have a new instrument, which might add a different, or doing the researcher might add an instrument that would require. But if you have a survey and you change the URL of the survey link, you wouldn't have to get the approval of anyone like that. So there is a gray area here in terms of where you need to, get the approval, and you either now, or could you talk about it later about those changes?
Yeah,
Or
I can
both.
talk about that now. So for most changes that if your study's expedited or full board, most changes that are done, you definitely need to submit an amendment to get those changes approved. That you gave an example of like a URL change. If that's something that I don't think would require an amendment, like a prompt amendment, but if you have to make changes in the future, you could update that. But if you're, of course, if you're making like a payment change or adding a data collection instrument or adding a whole new subject group, you'd want to submit an amendment for the study. Exempt research has a little bit more flexibility. It's exempt. It's called exempt because it's exempt from federal regulation. And so if you're making minor like wordsmithing changes, so you have a survey that has 50 questions and you want to add a couple but remove a couple and maybe kind of change the order of the survey and change the wording and things like that. For an exempt research study, you would not require, that wouldn't prompt an amendment. You don't have to get approval for like a small change like that. I think what we call it would be a substantive change. So something that's going to change the information that the subjects would consent to. So if you make changes to your survey instrument and the purpose and the questions are still, in line with what they were initially approved, just a little bit different, that wouldn't require an amendment. If you're adding questions that are completely beyond what the purpose of the research is, so hypothetically, say your study is about like food preferences, so something we'd expect to see questions about food and like types of food you like to eat, things like that. But then if you started asking questions about travel and medical related questions like that weren't related to food or kind of something like that, we would want to see an amendment for that and kind of update the study, like the overall purpose and things. So if the information in your study is going to change what the subject consented to, that would prompt an amendment for an exempt research study. So, but I would say if you're ever in doubt, you can always contact us to let us to ask us if the change you're making would require an amendment for an exempt study.
Right.
And then usually by default, if you're making any changes for an expedited or full board study, you'd want to get that approved.
So for instance, your committee, you're defending your proposal and Dr. Bonk says, I think your effort scale could use a couple more items, it's expanded from 10 to 12 items. You won't have to get approval on that instance. But if Dr. Bonk says, you're not getting enough subjects to participate in your survey because you didn't give them an incentive. Why don't you offer them Amazon gift cards as an incentive? Maybe $20, $30, whatever it is. I did tell you all three of you yesterday that you will need approval for changing the incentives, right, Adam?
Yeah. Yeah, so those are the general kind of conditions for an amendment. So yeah.
And usually amendments don't take as much time as the initial round of reviews. Usually can get them, so don't stress out that you change your study and your study is going to start next week. Oftentimes the amendments can be done internally without going to the IRB board because there's usually simple amendments that don't require a full IRB approval, and you just get them in as soon as you can and see.
Yeah, I was any with a new study or amendments, the sooner you get it in, the better. If you can allow yourself, especially a new study, allow yourself a little bit more time. So yeah, that's always it's easier to get a study approved, and once it's approved, then you don't have to worry about starting the research the very next day. Like you want to give yourself a little bit of time there. Oops. Okay. So when do the regulations apply? So this has to be research, so that's one key component, but it has to be research by the federal definition. So this is a systematic investigation that's designed to contribute to generalizable knowledge. So that's the extra part. So research, a systematic investigation is generally any sort of research that you're doing where you have a research question or a hypothesis and you have a standardized method of data collection. So, a survey, an interview, a focus group, something like that, where that's research. Where the federal regulation would kick in for research is that the goal or your intent for that is to kind of advance science and society. So you want to present or publish your findings. This could be for your dissertation, a thesis, if you want to publish in a journal or at a conference. things like that. So yeah, if the goal of your research is to kind of expand the knowledge base of your discipline, that's where the regulations would kick in. So hypothetically, I could ask you guys to do a survey to evaluate my presentation. It'd be standardized, a systematic investigation where everyone would have the same questions. But the goal or intent for that is not generalizable. So my presentation skills wouldn't be generalizable information. So I wouldn't want to present and publish my findings. That would be more of like a quality improvement or a quality assessment study where I'll evaluate my practices and try to better meet the needs of students. And even another example, at the end of every semester, you would have a course evaluation or a program evaluation where you fill out a survey kind of rating how the semester was or how a professor was. That's research. It all gets sent in, but it's not usually that's internal research that remains within the department. So it's not the goal or intent of that is not intended for generalizability. So if you have a research plan, you have a research question, a hypothesis you want to test, and your goal is to kind of present and publish your findings, that's where the regulations would kick in. The other part there is we have the most important piece is the human subjects. So if you're doing research about a living individual, either through direct interaction or intervention, or through identifiable private information, so secondary analysis of data, that's where you would need IRB approval. If you say if you're getting data from a secondary source and there's no interaction with subjects, so you're not going to survey or interview anyone, or no one's going to come participate in an experiment, and so you're just looking at secondary data there. If it's de-identified data, you would not need IRB approval because there's no interaction with the human subjects or private identifiable information. Something an interaction doesn't have to be a physical interaction. So if you're doing online surveys, that's still considered an interaction. Even if you're not getting any identifiable information from them, if you're doing like an anonymous survey online, you would need IRB approval for that. So yeah, so when you have research and human subjects, you essentially would need IRB review for your proposal. So there are not all research has to be reviewed and approved at the same level. There's essentially 3 different levels of review. Exempt review is minimal risk research. It's not exempt that doesn't mean you don't have to do it. It's exempt from federal regulations, but the Human Subjects Office, we make that final determination to make sure that the research is eligible for exemption, and we give approval for that. There's 8 different categories, so you can your study could fit into one or more. You wouldn't have to necessarily submit a new study for each category that applies. So it can be, exempt category 1, 2, and 4 all in the same study. So as long as if it fits in those categories, it's all for the same research. It could be under one study. Expedited review. This is also minimal risk research, but now the federal regulations take place, and so this is where essentially the IRB comes in. So, with an exempt study, it kind of remains in the Human Subjects Office. With an expedited study, we do the initial review of the study, and once it's ready, we'll send it to an IRB member, just one member. So it's called expedited, not because it's faster by any means, but it only has to be seen by one IRB member instead of the full committee. There's 7 different categories. Most of these are biomedical data collection methods for expedited review, but there is some social and behavioral categories in there. Full board review, this is where our greater than minimal risk research is. So this is where the full committee is going to come and play. And essentially minimal risk is essentially the anticipation or magnitude of harm is nothing more than what you would experience through routine daily life or through common medical examination. So, if you're interviewing somebody, generally speaking, that's not going to place them at more than minimal risk. Or asking somebody questions to participate in the survey. So that's kind of minimal risk procedures. If you're studying, you're all in education. So if you're studying the effectiveness of teaching methods, the curriculum, instruction, things like that, that's very minimal risk research. Usually the type of data collection is course grades, course assignments, so things that are already happening in a class regardless of the research. So there's no anticipation or increase of harm. So that would be considered minimal risk. Yeah, so any research that's greater than minimal risk has to be reviewed by the full board. So for exempt research, some common examples, common educational practice in a common educational setting. So if you're again studying the effectiveness of teaching methods, it's very likely that your research will be exempt. And some examples of this could be, say if you have a new vocabulary test that you want to test to see if it's better than the standard vocabulary test, you might have 2 sections of a course, take a vocabulary test, and have them see if there's a difference in like retention or something like that. So if you're, doing something like a novel approach like that, likely your research would be exempt. With the funny, I would say this is exempt category 1. This is the only category where the location of the research is important and the purpose. So the purpose, you have to be studying the effectiveness of the teaching methods, and it has to be done in a common educational setting. So generally this would be like a school, a library, but realistically, this could be anywhere where something is being taught. So, if you're doing swimming lessons, if you're studying the curriculum and instruction for that, a pool could be an educational setting. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a traditional classroom for that. If you're doing educational tests, survey procedures, interview procedures with adults, your research could be exempt. So ideally, this is if you're collecting data from an individual through survey, interview, or focus group. If they're adults, your research will likely be exempt. Observations of public behavior, this would be exempt. This would generally be, you'd be observing public behavior. So you're in a park or at a concert, or say if you're sitting in the dining room of a restaurant and you're just kind of observing, other tables and things like that. There's no interaction with subjects. You're privately observing kind of public behavior. Research like that can be exempt. If you're doing any sort of benign behavioral intervention, so if you have like a little experiment where participants come to a lab to respond to like stimuli, as long as they're adults, that's something that could be eligible for exemption. If you're doing secondary analysis of data, if it's publicly available or if you're reporting it without identifiable information, that could be exempt. So an example of that is like voter registration records, that's publicly available data. And so if you're doing secondary analysis of data involves that, that could be exempt.
So
Yeah.
so often my students want to do discussion forums or social media.
Yeah.
If it's publicly available social media in WeChat, Kakao Talk, Line, Facebook, any of that, if they're analyzing that data set or collecting it without names, they don't have to worry about it. What if they're collecting that data set and looking at particular names?
That's fine, as long as it's publicly available. So especially when you're dealing with digital online data, from like websites like Facebook, Twitter, WeChat, if you're joining like a public group and kind of observing conversations and things like that, you can record identifiable information. Where we would express caution would be is, say if you're joining a private support group, where like say if there's a support group for domestic abuse. Right. One of the categories, or when we think of public observation and with secondary analysis of data, is if there's a reasonable expectation of privacy. So if you observe people in a park, a public setting, or if you are public Twitter posts or something like that, there's no expectation of privacy because it's all publicly available data. But if you join that private support group, there is an expectation of privacy because generally speaking, the participants in that are in a safe place where they're discussing specific matters of abuse or neglect or something like that. And so if it's something like that's the case, we would say there is an expectation of privacy, and then we'd want to know more about getting the appropriate steps to kind of consent people in those groups to make sure it's okay to use that data.
So what about our Canvas discussions, which is private because they have password protected? Then, if a student wants to analyze those discussions and with names, that would have to get some IRB. If they collect the log data without names or purge the names, then maybe they don't need that,
Yeah, so if you have access to a public or to a private data source like that, that's a good example. You wouldn't necessarily need consent if you're as long as you're recording without identifiable information. But that Canvas as a specific example might not be the best one because Canvas is essentially kind of the information in there is kind of could be considered an educational record and be subject to FERPA regulations.
Right.
And so with most cases, you would have to get written consent or written permission to access that information. So it's still something like that could still be exempt. You could still get do analysis, but you in that case, you might still need written permission from the participants and still be, it could still be exempt though.
Okay, thank you.
Canvas is that's always a fun one because it's like it can be used for so many different resources, but then it's depending on how you're accessing data and what data is there, it could be subject to FERPA regulations too, which that can be a little bit tricky.
So Amelia joined us from Japan. Does she need to get, I know the answer to this, but does she need to get human subjects at IU even if her organization in Japan requires it?
Yes, yeah. So well, I guess it depends. So if you're doing research for or on behalf of IU, so if you're doing research for your dissertation or thesis and you're abroad as well, you would still need IU's IRB approval. And then if you're at another institution, that you might also have to, if they also have, human subjects research regulations, there could be a chance where you need approval with them. So if you're at like a university, they might have their own kind of human research protection program where you need approval. So there could be a case where you need dual approval, so approval from IU and from the local institution.
Here's another one. So Sung-hee and Alicia joined me in Indiana, but before they come to Indiana for a year, they've collected data and they bring that data with them and write the report up and try to publish that data while they're at Indiana as a visiting scholar. But they only abided by their in-country requirements. Must they do anything special for Indiana to publish that work?
No, yeah. So if that was if that began at your home institution and you're still doing data analysis and things like that, as long as it's not for or on behalf of IU, the regulations wouldn't apply there because you wouldn't be doing it for assuming you wouldn't be doing it for like any sort of publications through IU. So you wouldn't be publishing that as an affiliate from IU.
Yeah. So avoid saying in publishing that, Alicia, Indiana University visiting scholars, hey, stay with your home institution in China and you don't have to worry about it. Sung-hee, stay with your organization in Korea and you won't have to worry about that. So
yeah.
Sung-hee or Alicia, you want to bring up anything that related? You have a question so far?
Yeah, I do think that okay, Sung-hee, you go ahead, please. Yeah.
You first.
Okay. So I actually have a following up question just now. I think that Dr. Bank mentioned a very important question that to me, because just now you mentioned about Canvas, and I also want to know that if we want to do some research, here you have YouTube. Or Twitter, and we have Bilibili is also very famous website platform for us to analyze data, discourse analysis, to do this kind of research. So my question is, do I need to get permission from the releaser or public developer if I want to analyze their video and following up the comments of these people or reviewers or some people who what they talk about?
Yeah.
Do I need
to? So for those, if it's like a publicly posted video on YouTube or another social media site, you wouldn't need permission to analyze those videos. And then the same thing would go with the comments as well. You wouldn't need you wouldn't need to recruit or consent subjects to collect those comments that are on there because the idea there is that they're publicly posted. Anyone can access them, so it's not considered private information.
A lot of people these days are machine learning people scraping that data and analyzing, big data in effect.
Yeah.
But it's public data, so you don't have to worry too much about that kind of thing. So, Sung-hee?
Yes. I have two questions. How long does it usually take from IRB application to approval? And second one is, in Korea, there is an IRB exceptions.
Mhm.
Even if the research is a survey of students, it's not individuals, but it's a kind of educational development or class assessment. There is a IRB exceptions. So is there same or is there any IRB exceptions in here?
Yeah, so I don't know if the definition of exemption would be the same, but if you're looking like the exempt level of review, and certain research, if it meets the criteria, can be approved as an exemption. And so at IU, our policy is that we would still review and approve exempt research. And so at other institutions, they might not require approval for exempt research. So if you're doing research if the researcher feels that it meets the criteria for approval, their institution might not require review of that. We require review because we want to make sure that if you are doing research, that it does meet the exemption. So even though it's exempt from federal regulation, we want to make sure that's true because we'll often see studies that somebody says, "Oh, I don't need approval; it's exempt," or something like that, or a study that's submitted as exempt, and we'll review it, and I'll be looking at the study, and it'll be, something like a quick 5 or 10 minute survey, which would generally qualify for exemption, and then I'll read like the consent form, and it'll start talking about an MRI machine, and so having somebody go on an MRI machine would need full board review. And so we want to make sure that the level of review is accurate and that that research is the right approval. So there are exemptions, but I think at IU at least we still require approval for those. And then for your first question, the duration, how long it takes to get approval, can kind of depend on the level of review. Generally speaking, exempt research can take 1 to 2 weeks. The proposal is a shorter questionnaire. And then, if you're looking at like surveys, public observation, things like that, there's not a lot of, there's minimal information that we would need for approval. And so that can take about 1 to 2 weeks, just for our kind of the volume of studies that we receive. For an expedited study, I would say that's going to take 1 to 3 weeks, a little bit more time because the federal regulations kick in, and there's that final step where we send it to an IRB member to give final approval. So it's minimal risk research, but there's a little bit more information that is needed in the proposal, and then there's the additional step of sending it to an IRB member, and so there could be some back and forth there. So I would say about 1 to 3 weeks to get approval. For full board research, this is going to take a lot longer since this is our research that's considered more than minimal risk. So the anticipation or magnitude of harm is elevated. The full committee would review this, and this could take 1 to 2 months to get approval from when it's submitted because it goes to the full committee. They meet once a month, and so if your study's sent there and it's there's lots of revisions or things that they want to see, it'll have to be sent back or revised and sent back the next month, and so that could be 1 to 2 months, or even some cases it could be 3 months to get approval. Those take a little bit more time to do.
Thank you.
So Adam, they probably need to know that things are quicker than when Adam started. He's gotten them to ramp up faster. It used to be more than a week or two to get approval. Back in the day, there was a hold on some, there were some issues 15 years ago, about 10 to 15 years ago. So it's much improved than, so any old stories you hear from faculty are no longer true for the most part.
For the most part,
yeah, for the most part. But, when you send it to the IRB, you said you're sending it to one person.
Yes.
So do they have to meet with the entire committee to tell the others what proposals they've looked at and have everyone then agree and vote like going to the Supreme Court? You might have one member of the Supreme Court look at, the law and everyone's got to ultimately vote, or is it okay if it's not a real big issue? Can the one member approve it? And if so, is there a day of the week? They used to be like Wednesday mornings or Thursday mornings. They all IRB meet on that day. So if you get it into them by Wednesday, you can get it reviewed right away. But if you don't get it there by that time, it's going to take another week.
Yeah. So for the expedited study, yeah, it only has to go to one IRB member.
Okay.
Essentially, a report is given to the full committee, and that's something that they can review, but they don't have to. And the reason why it's expedited is essentially once the IRB reviewer determines that it is minimal risk, then that means it doesn't have to go to the full board committee for review. And then as far as day of the week, they're reviewed daily. So if I submit if a study's ready for IRB approval and it's expedited, I'll assign it to the IRB review queue, and essentially daily people are getting in there and reviewing and approving those. And so usually we hear back within 24 hours from an IRB member if there's changes needed or approval. Hopefully that's usually the end goal there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
You might want to move on or
Sure, yeah.
Stuck on this slide, yeah.
And so real quick with expedited studies, one thing I'll say is most of the data collection is going to be biomedical. So if you're doing like basic, height, weight, blood pressure, blood draws, if you're getting hair, saliva, fingernail clippings for analysis from human subjects, those would likely be expedited. Still minimal risk. They're non-invasive medical procedures. If you're doing research with minors, say if you're surveying or interviewing children, the federal regulations would kick in. And then for full board research, more than likely, you wouldn't have to do this. But if you do, usually it's experimental drugs for medical devices or invasive medical procedures. And then anything that's likely to cause harm or discomfort beyond normal daily life, things like that would be sent to the full board. But generally speaking, most of the research that you would be doing would probably fit in the exempt or expedited level. Oops. There we go.
I just have a quick question on that because
Yeah.
I was trying to figure out where VR headsets would fit in. They do cause dizziness and motion sickness in some students.
So something like that, if you're doing VR headsets, depending on the type of research you're doing, it could fit somewhere in exempt or expedited, depending on the data collection methods. And as far as risk, that's something to consider is like dizziness. If you're working with a general population, that's something that you'd want to describe how that would be monitored. I think it'd still be minimal risk. The only time I would think it's more than minimal risk is if you have working with participants with who have some sort of stability issues already, where the increase of falling might be even more so than what they'd experience.
Okay.
But probably minimal risk still. And then just depending on the design of the study, if you're having students do VR in a classroom and seeing if it's helping with learning, that could be exempt. Or if you're having people use VR and have a lot of random stimuli and kind of you're doing an experiment, it could be exempt or expedited depending on like the age or something like that. But as far as dizziness, that would be something that you could report as a risk, but it'd still be considered minimal risk.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Adam, I also, before you move on, I also have another question for you.
Sure.
Regarding the common educational practices in educational settings. Does this mean that if I do research in my class, by conducting interviews or questionnaires with my students, or observe or research of another teacher's teaching methods, teaching activities, qualified exception from requiring IRB permission?
Yeah, so we wouldn't consider surveys or interviews common educational practice because generally you don't survey. I mean, I guess surveys are kind of done or questionnaires could be done, but surveying and interviewing, we would consider those specific research interventions. and we wouldn't call that a common educational practice. We kind of will be a little bit lenient if, say, if you have somebody do a vocabulary test and then you want to ask them, what did you think of that vocabulary test? Was it hard? Was it easy? Like a Likert scale or something like that? We'll kind of let those slide a little bit because it's specific questions about that test or exam or something that they took. Something like that will allow as common educational practice. But whenever you kind of get onto anything that goes on personal opinions, very specific questions like that, that's where we might say that's kind of, it's not normal to interview, and especially individual interviews, like, are you going to, then it gets into logistics. Are you going to interview every student? What are other students doing when you're interviewing them? So it kind of gets a little bit complicated there. But yeah, so we wouldn't consider surveys or interviews to be common educational practice. And then doing classroom observations, that can fit into common educational practice because you're observing the curriculum and instruction. And so that can be exempt research.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We've had another student show up from class that Ed's joined us. Ed, we've missed about 20 questions a week, so you're gonna definitely want to watch the recording. There's been a lot of good questions, but there's more to come, Ed, so don't hang in there.
I will. I'm sorry, I had work to do,
I
dealing
know.
with different time zones.
Ed works at Dell Computer.
Oh, cool.
And he's in Bloomington this week for the IST conference. So he's at the Grant Street Inn Bed and Breakfast for the week. And is going to be attending all day Friday for the IST conference here. So
Nice. Cool. Glad to have you.
Oh, thanks for being here. Great to be here.
And so one thing to think about is when you submit a proposal, all research proposals are done online. But in addition to that, we want to make sure that you submit essentially anything that's going to be shared with or seen by the participant in research should be submitted for review. And I like to see 3 different things with research. So recruitment materials. So this is going to be any sort of advertisement for your study. So if it's a flyer, an email, a verbal script, if you're posting, a post online through social media, whatever you plan to do, we'd want a sample draft of what that would look like. So if you have a flyer, we'd expect to see a flyer for review. If you're going to send emails, we would want an email template. You definitely don't want to send actual, because again, you don't want to begin the research. So you don't want to, and sometimes I see this where we'll get a PDF of an actual email that was sent with the person's name. You absolutely don't have to do that. We just want a text of what will be sent once it's approved. So yeah, so flyers, emails, verbal scripts. If you're going to a heavily populated area and asking people if they want to take a 5-minute survey, you just a little draft script of what that conversation looks like. We'd expect to see that for review. The next step for the consent process is we'd want to expect to see some consent materials. So like a tool that helps describe all the elements of consent that should be given to the participant. This could be an informed consent form, a study information sheet, or if you have minors in research, we have what's called an assent template that can be given to children in research. So it's usually written at like a 5th grade reading level. Consent materials should be written in a language that's understandable by the participants. And so you always want to use lay or common language. So you don't have to be verbose or use any sort of academic vernacular. It should be very clear and concise, and usually written at a lower reading level, so that way they can clearly understand the risks, the benefits, and what they're being asked to do and things like that. And lastly, any data collection instruments that will be submitted for review, those should be submitted as well. So this is if you're doing surveys, we'd expect to see a copy of your survey. If you're doing interviews or focus groups, we'd want to see sample interview questions. Usually we recommend 5 to 10 different questions or topics that will come up. You don't have to submit every research question because you yourself might not know every question that you're going to ask. We'll want to see sample stimuli if you're doing like an experiment where there's audio or visual stimuli that you want subjects to respond to. So this could be, pictures, videos. If you are doing any sort of audio stimulus, if there's recordings or something like that, you could submit copies of those for review. And then, like a little soundbite of that for review. So yeah, so anything that's going to be shared with or seen by a participant should be submitted for review. So once you have your study designed and you have all your kind of data collection instruments and all your materials ready, you'd want to begin that process of submitting your study for review. And so this is just a very quick workflow process of what that process looks like. So all submissions are made through quality protocols. If you go to one.iu.edu and type IRB or all IRB services, you'll see this app. And when you click on that, that takes you to the IRB portal, and that's where you can create new proposals, or if you have an approved study, you can do amendments to update an approved study. When you submit your study, there's kind of some prerequisites. All research requires city training. So this is kind of a educational training that talks about different areas of research that might apply to your study. So there's 11 different topics that you'd have to read about, and then each topic has between 2 to 6 questions. And so this is something that's required again for all researchers. You would need a passing score of 80%. This is in no way a test to see if you can do research. Again, it's more of an informative requirement to make sure that you're kind of thinking about some research. And so, you know, there's a section on HIPAA information. So if you're reading private health or getting data with private health information, HIPAA regulations might apply. Very often this doesn't happen in educational research. So this is an example of something where, like, if you miss, you know, a question on that, you might get a 50%. So you can automatically go back and retake that.
Yeah, I think we've done this for a couple of our courses. We've had to do that.
Yeah,
training.
yeah. So yeah, if you've done any research methods courses, or if you've done research, you probably have done the city training already.
And also, it's a 5-year thing now, the certificate.
Yeah.
And often it's accepted if you're doing joint research with another university like UT Austin, Ed, they'll accept our score, you know, our certificates. It's the same exam pretty much, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
and so now you get 5 years. It's a big difference, I think.
It's a big difference, yeah. Because
Man.
3 years can creep on you pretty fast. So
Adam,
yeah,
I have another question for you.
sure.
So I got my social behavior researcher certificate after 11 tests, and I also complete additional internet-based research test, and I passed it, but it not give me certificate. Will it influence me to do the research? Cannot get this certificate? Because I feel confused why after the internet-based research test, I also passed it, but I cannot get a certificate from it. I only get one certificate.
Yeah. So we only require it's called the social behavioral researcher stage 1.
Yeah,
so that's the only required one. But on the city site, there's multiple different tutorials that you can take that aren't required. So as long as you take the social behavioral researcher, that's the only required one that you do. Any other one would be an optional one that we wouldn't require.
So her question maybe also gets at, when she takes the internet-based research course and passes, can she put that on her resume, on her CV, that she's, you know, passed this? And does it qualify her to do additional types of research that if, you know, she was partnering with a company, let's say, and she's is certified as an internet-based researcher, is this something valuable? Do other people take it and find it to be of value?
That's a good question. I don't know if I have an answer for that, if you can use it for like your CV, or if there's like specific kind of benefits for that. Yeah, unfortunately, I wouldn't have like an answer for that, because for us, our only requirement is this specific exam that for research purposes. So doing any sort of module, I don't know if how that could apply, you know, outside or benefit in additional ways. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I have any experience with that.
Yeah, thanks both of you.
Yeah, is there any place you might look that comes to mind of, other than the city website itself, is there a contact person there?
There's definitely city contacts on the website to kind of go through there. And I don't know if there's any kind of FAQs on completing tutorials and like how that can apply. But that would be where I would start, is with when you go to the city website. I'm looking for contacts there. We might even have on our website, we might even have a contact name or email on the Human Subjects website to go through city, to go through there, yeah. But that's where I would start to kind of see, how that can apply. And there could be FAQs that can kind of mention like how you can use your city training for other endeavors.
Makes sense to me. Thanks.
Yeah, because there's lots of free training if you're affiliated with an institution. There's lots of different training you can do.
Well, this is the age of the micro credential, so it makes sense that she took this to get that credential of some kind.
Yeah.
Where's the value added going to appear?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So in addition to city training, we also have a financial online conflict of interest disclosure form. This is something that's required for all faculty and staff, regardless of research. But if you are doing research, we want to make sure that any sort of financial conflict of interest is disclosed. Most often with social and behavioral research, we don't see any financial conflicts of interest. Usually where this comes into play is, say, you have somebody in the school of or pharmacy who's also employed at like a pharmaceutical company. They could be doing research that uses drugs or medical devices from the company that they also work for. And so there's a significant financial conflict of interest that has to be disclosed. And so that's something that's reported to the university. And then the conflict of interest office will have a management plan, and we'll kind of provide guidance on the additional language that might be needed in like a consent form. But for most often, if you're doing social and behavioral research, it's very rare that there's a disclosure that impacts the research in any way. But regardless, this is a quick 5-minute questionnaire. So if you're key personnel in research, you'll want to have this completed. And this is a small requirement, but we won't be able to approve the study until that's done or completed. There's one last policy, a requirement, like a prerequisite for IU. Students in most staff roles aren't eligible to be listed as the principal investigator on a study. You'll need a faculty member or advisor listed as the principal investigator. So if this is for your thesis or dissertation, you'd want a faculty member or advisor listed, and then you would list yourself as a co-PI. And so this is an IU policy. Basically, so if something went wrong in the research, that a student is not taking all of the heat from any sort of outback that can happen in the study. So the PI should be the advisor and kind of assume responsibility in the research. So those are 3 prerequisites: city, COI, and making sure that we have eligible principal investigator. And so that is all I have for the slides, but I definitely have time for any questions you might have.
That last slide, what about a visiting scholar who comes to Indiana and wants to do research? Must they have their host be the PI, or can they be the PI if they're, have their PhD in resident country?
Yeah, so if they're a visiting scholar, if they're at IU and they're kind of doing research for or behalf on IU from some sort of like fulfillment, then they would need, if they wouldn't be considered faculty. So they'd probably still need a faculty member and advisor since they're just visiting. And so, and that's kind of the part of the PI eligibility requirement being faculty, is because usually their tenure, they're here at the university and should be aware of kind of the research regulations and things like that.
Okay. Others,
which is kind of funny because you could have somebody who's a faculty member being a visiting scholar. They would essentially have all the requirements at their home institution, but like being a visiting scholar, they would still, need an advisor to, help them do the research.
Yes, sure. Yeah, it makes sense. You can ask specific questions about your research now. You can be as specific as you want. We've covered a lot of things yesterday that you possibly could ask. Does anyone want to jump in and ask one?
I think my question is, how far in advance can we do this from Like his
you can-
proposal?
Yeah, you could begin the process as soon as you want. I always encourage giving yourself a little bit more time for approval. I wasn't sure if you caught we talked a little bit about the timeline. And so usually for minimal risk research, it could take 1 to 3 weeks to get approval. So say if you want to do research in June, you could start applying for research now, and then you'll give yourself more than enough time to get approval. If you have to make any changes, that you can have amendments done with more than enough time. So yeah, really, you can begin the process. The only time it's not when I would say it's too soon is if you haven't finished the study design. So sometimes I see proposals where you can see it's just not ready for review. But if you have kind of everything ready, but the beginning date is not until for a few months out, you can start approval pretty much, or the approval process pretty much as soon as you want.
Yeah, I have one question. If I receive IRB as a visiting scholar, then where should I indicate my affiliation in my thesis? Are there any rules?
So if you're doing it, so if you're a visiting scholar, and then if it's for your thesis or dissertation at your home institution, you wouldn't have to, if IU is not engaged in research, you wouldn't have to list IU or receive IU's IRB approval. So you'd have to be doing research for or on behalf of IU. But yeah, so if you were doing research kind of as any sort of requirement while you're visiting, you can list both your institutions in your like a consent form document there.
Thank you.
Yeah, she is a PhD, so it wouldn't be her dissertation. This is really, research related to her home institution. So,
Yeah. See, that sounds like engagement. It would be IU might not be engaged in the research that you're doing, especially if it's not for or on behalf of IU. Sorry, Katie, I cut you off a couple times there.
No,
No
and
problem.
Ed, going back to Ed's question, the length used to be much longer, Ed. And revisions, modifications don't take that long. And also, Ed, often at the dissertation proposal, this applies to Katie and Amelia and Mika and Shen, when you go to proposal and you present your proposal and you have your defense, there are times when the faculty will say to you, do you have an IRB done? And I think it's our requirement. We cannot sign past the dissertation proposal until you have a completed IRB. So we can, maybe you can get 2 signatures, but you won't get your advisor to sign. So that's why it's, if you want to get going on your study, you want to at least have it close to being accepted, maybe in the rounds where in the next week or so, it's going to be fully accepted, and so forth. You don't be scrambling at the last minute before your proposal defense and putting together your IRB. That's my point.
Yeah.
Katie.
My question is if you can offer any pitfalls or just, generic advice of things you've seen that have caused rejections to happen or things to be sent back or delayed that we can avoid. Obviously not including an MRI machine in, like you mentioned, but are there other things that come up a lot that you can give us kind of heads up?
So most common, we look for completeness and consistency. So when a proposal is written, there's various questions about the research that you're doing, and so you'll want to list and describe each procedure and give the duration. And so you have your proposal that has all the information. The recruitment material and consent material and data collection instruments, we'll look at that too to make sure that information is also consistent. So usually inconsistencies are kind of one of the main setbacks. So if like you say you're doing a focus group that's going to last 90 minutes, and then the recruitment flyer says there's a 20-minute focus group, and then the consent form says there's an hour focus group. So each 3 of those could be inconsistent with each other. And so that's like a small thing that's sent back. Just consistency issues for that. Another thing could be if you have multiple subject groups. So if you're doing like research with students, teachers, paraprofessionals, parents of the students, principals, and you have 5 different subject groups. If they're all doing different tasks, you essentially have to kind of your proposal has to really kind of when it's asking a question and, you want to make sure you're addressing all of those different groups. And then in addition to that, you want to submit recruitment material, consent material, data collections for all 5 groups. And so oftentimes what I see is like the focal, usually with education research, the focus is the student. And so lots of the questions will only address the student's activities in the research. So if you're missing information on other groups, that's another kind of thing that would send it back. And one thing I'll also add too, part of the review process is, one, we want to make sure subjects are safe. The second part, what we do is make sure that the research documented, that it's clearly documented and there's no kind of like ambiguous questions left behind that can say like, that we'd have to answer. So some of the revisions that we send back, it's never bad if a study goes back. We just want to make sure that everything's clear and consistent. And there could be a small issue is that I was mentioning this, or this happened earlier today, where in the proposal, it said the subjects may do a survey. And so for me, I'm like, may is an option so that they may not do it. So what would prompt that, may or may not? And so I just had a clarifying question on like, what do you mean by may? And then they quickly turned the revisions around and it said will. So that's just a word issue that might have revisions. That there was nothing wrong with it. It was just a little bit ambiguous. And so we had to get a little bit of clarification. And so, so if the study's ever sent back, it's never a bad thing. Most studies do get sent back one or even sometimes 2 times just to make sure that it's clearly documented. So, so consistency issues, I would say, are just the main thing to be sent back. Usually I don't see anything that's kind of wild. It's rare to get the MRI slept in, with the survey. So.
Other questions? We've had great questions tonight. And we had yesterday too, when I met you all one-to-one. So anyone wanna?
I guess I
jump
have one more. And
Sure.
so we get IRB approval prior to submitting our proposal. When does that expire? Now, I certainly don't expect that I will find this out, but how long is it valid for?
Yeah, so approvals, exempt and expedited approval is almost it's indefinite. So we won't close it until the researcher actually closes it. So as long as you're at IU and you're still doing that research, you can keep collecting data as long as you wish. Full board studies, those have to go through a renewal process. And so those are the often ones that where if it's a researcher leaves the institution or, it's kind of been ongoing, those usually get closed, but they essentially only get approval for a year. If you don't renew your study, essentially you can't conduct any research until you reopen that study. But yeah, exempt and expedited studies are indefinite.
But Adam,
What's
at
the
some
but?
point, Dr. Bonk will get an email and you
Oh,
will
yeah.
get an email saying, this study, is it still going on, or
Yeah.
can we close it? So because I'll be listed as I'm not your advisor, Katie, but your advisor will be listed. Dr. Brush will be listed, and he'll get an email from the IRB office. Has this study is it going on, or and sometimes I don't know because the student might want to collect a little extra data, or might have something, even though they've finished the dissertation. So here's the question, Adam. What if they've done their data and they've defended their dissertation and all that stuff, but they're still publishing articles based on that data? Do they have to leave it open, or is it considered closed once they've completed the study, got their analyses? And if they want to go in a conference, if Emilio's going to the International Conference on Japanese Educators, and that's coming up next year, a year from now, does she have to keep this study open?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you still need to access any identifiable data, the study should remain open. So kind of if you think about approval, you need approval for collecting data, or if it's secondary, if you're getting secondary identifiable information. And then when something's non-human subject research, there's no subject interaction and there's no identifiable information. So if you're still doing data analysis and things like that, but all of the data is de-identified and there's no subject interaction, you can close the study at that point. But if you're doing yeah, if you need identifiable information, say you have audio and video recordings that you will constantly have to refer to, you should keep that study open. And then, of course, if you leave IU and you're no longer at our institution, if you're at a new institution, you would have to check with them to see what they would need for approval. And then if you're still doing research and you're not at an institution, you wouldn't have any sort of obligation, and IU wouldn't be the have any oversight at that point.
Have you ever had people that they thought they were done with that data, but then they find other possible uses and have
Oh,
to
yeah.
can they reopen?
Yeah, so we've had studies, sometimes it's just a new submission, because usually there's so much time that like we've had studies that were approved in 1999, and then they thought they were done, and then they wanted to kind of reopen the study to continue collecting data. And by that point, the systems that we use and the forms that we use have changed so much that we'll just have them submit a new study. But there's been times definitely where like a study's been closed, and even as short as like a couple months or even a year, they want to kind of do that, and we can reopen a closed study as long as it's been a short timeline. But sometimes if it's been long enough, we'll just have a new submission.
Right, that makes sense too. And you can copy a lot of the stuff anyway.
Yeah,
So it won't take you all that long.
Yeah,
And the forms may change too, and they do change
Exactly.
over time.
yeah.
So yeah. Any last things before we call it in tonight? If not, I just want to remind you, we're not meeting next week, and the week after that, spring break. So it'd be a week from Monday, I think we're gonna meet at 7 o'clock-ish. I think both my classes will meet with that guest. We'll talk about translating research. Because he's expert in translation in the educational technology space. And then I might give some writing tips after that. Might be a late night, a week from Monday. We'll see. Again, I thank you all for your questions. It's been fabulous. Let's give Adam a round of applause here. Fabulous. I mean, we covered a lot of territory tonight. Chen hasn't even said anything. Chen, you need to get on the air here at least once and say hi to Adam. Chen, unmute your mic. Unmute your mic and say hi.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm
You
sorry,
learned something tonight.
you see my hair. I'm just in a mess because I just came back from gym and I've got sweaty, so I'm afraid to turn off the camera.
You don't have to just say hi. I just said say hi,
Yeah. Hi Adam, thank you
Hi,
so
nice
much.
to meet you.
Yeah, I learned a lot from your presentation. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Anyone else want to make a comment and thank you, Adam? I'm gonna stop the recording here. Thanks again, Adam.
No problem.
We're gonna stop this recording now.